Ghina Ribai, who is a researcher in the Bahrain Forum for Human Rights. As we have been accustomed, the Bahraini authorities have restricted the religious practices during Ashura against the Shiite and discrimination against them and terrorizing their social existence, and all of that against any tolerance and reform principles. And this is very clear with what the authorities is actually practicing in the fields. Wherever there's a Bahraini field demanding citizenship rights, and despite the recommendations issued by the independent NGOs and the international NGOs and all the recommendations by some states, especially in the periodical show on the religious restrictions in Bahrain. However, the Bahraini authorities is ignoring any logical speech, and Ashura is considered as the central season where the Bahraini authorities would practice its utmost arbitrary practices, and for this sake we shall launch a report headlined Bahrain Religious Tolerance Within the Crossfire of Violations. It's issued by three NGOs: Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, and the Gulf Institute for Human Rights, on the violations of religious freedoms practiced by the Bahraini authorities for the Ashura season in 2021. Now we shall be with Ms. Ibtisam Sa'igh, who's head for the documentation in Salam for Democracy. I welcome everyone and all the followers and everyone who's watching us. I shall speak about our mechanisms in monitoring and observing the religious violations that we are subject to. The main reason of documentation is linked directly to ameliorating the status of human rights in order to protect these human rights. So documentation isn't limited only to just monitoring what's going on and gathering information and how the practices are being done, but we are in charge of analyzing the problems, their reasons, and helping in their solutions. And during the past years, we have monitored documented a lot of violations which were systematically practiced due to repetition and ignorance and non-accountability for the assaults. This report actually documents all of these violations for 2021. It's headlined The Religious Tolerance Within the Crossfire of Violations, in which we have documented the religious season where the Muslim Shiite in Bahrain celebrate for 2 successive months for the past years. And also last year we have documented a lot of violations where the Shiite citizens are being subject for targeting. We are speaking here about sectarianism discrimination, which is practiced in a systematic way and an alleviating way in order to restrict any of the religious freedoms practices. Our monitoring team, we are following up on any news which are issued on the social media and on the media, official media, and we are documenting the cases who communicate with us in a direct way, and we also the cases which we monitor on the media. All of this fall below the sectarianism and the religious targeting. Most of the citizens were called for investigation. Most of them were Shiite. They were directly related to the religious events or either they are only just Shiite or they are in charge for the Husseiniyyat centers or preachers or religious men or authors. All of them were subject to a series of targeting, the most prominent of which being called for the police stations immediately without having the time to communicate with any of attorneys or even to know why they were called for investigation. Even at different times, some of these times were after 11 p.m., which is not an adequate time to perform any investigation. All of this is to restrict the religious freedoms. Of course, we have communicated with such cases, among of which were some persons who only happen to be in the places where the Shiites celebrate such or commemorate such funeral processions within specific limitations, and taking into consideration all the medical precautions recommended by the medical team, especially with what has to do with the COVID-19. However, the authorities have justified their actions and used the COVID-19 as one of their excuses to restrict these freedoms. On the other hand, we have seen a lot of other events that has not to do in any way with the Shiite citizens, like the sports programs, the art programs, and other programs being held in a very normal way. That's why we believe these violations are continuous, and while we communicated with these cases which we have monitored and documented, we witnessed fear because we feared that they would be accused of new charges, and this might end them up to have judgments issued against them and to force them to pay fines or by a bail to be set free. During this season, there was a very restriction for the prisoners of opinion. They were prevented from celebrating any religious celebrations or anniversaries, despite that these were saved by the Waqf al-Ja'fari. That's why a lot of strikes were held in the prisons to protest these decisions, and they wanted us to raise their voice and in order to prevent any future strikes to change this fact. And as human rights activists, we try to communicate with the prison's administration, but in most of the times, we and the families lack the truthful facts and information. They would manipulate the families and mislead them that there is no restriction inside the prisons. And most of the times, the prisoners wouldn't have any access to to communicate with the outer world, and therefore we wouldn't be able to document what's really going on. And they would be subject to punishments in order to prevent what's really going on in prison, especially in this field. Most of the prisoners were subject to solitary confinement, and they were prevented from doing any calls for like a week or more because they tried to commemorate these religious celebrations. A lot of statements were issued by prisoners inside the prison. They would ask and request from the international community, human rights activists, to be in solidarity with them and to exercise pressure on the prison administration so that they would be able to practice their very simple religious rights and freedoms. But despite all of that, they were prevented from communicating and reaching out to the outer world. With regards to us as human rights activists and as head of monitoring, I was following up with my team who was trying to document every event and to get the necessary information. But the media was covering this information, and it would think that when it would a little bit unveil this information. But through our field monitoring, we were able to tackle these cases and to unveil them, and especially for the Husseini slogans or banners. They would be taken off or taken down or removed by some people from the municipalities who were foreigner employees who were had the impunity of the security forces, and this would provoke the people who lived in the villages, especially the Shiite. They couldn't even practice this kind of right. We always sought to raise our voice and raise the voice of the victims who are trying to speak about this struggle due to the sensitivity of this very specific issue. But there is a very misleading in the official newspapers, and they're trying to whitewash what's really going on for real. And in some cases, they would underestimate what's going on. They would say, like, the black banners would be published on the social media, and they would say that it should be removed because it would cause COVID. All of this provoked the Shiite citizens, and they were meant to do that by a specific authority. We present to you this report which documents some of these cases which we were able to reach for, and we are pretty sure that there are a lot of other cases that we couldn't cover for a lot of reasons, probably fear or non-reporting or unawareness for what's really going on religious restrictions. But we are determined and sure that we present you this report, especially for the component people, to put an end for this and to obtain and give them back their human rights on the level of the whole Bahrain. The head of monitoring and documentation and Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, thank you again. I welcome you again on this webinar, and we are pleased to have you in this webinar, which was organized by Gulf Institute for Human Rights, Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, and Bahrain Forum for Human Rights. Headlined Bahrain Religious Tolerance Within the Crossfires of Violations. Through this webinar, we shall launch this report about the religious targeting in Ashura season during 2021 with the researcher in Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, Ms. Ghina Ribai. You have the platform. Thank you. As a conclusion for what was mentioned in the report, Bahrain Religious Tolerance Within the Crossfire of Violations, the arbitrary imprisonments or arrests in Ashura 2021 were 3. However, there were 18 cases called for investigation, including religious men who were in charge for funeral processions and preachers. They were called for police stations to investigate them on celebrating the occasion of Ashura. The violations of security forces were 42 cases distributed as follows. 2 destroying any scenes of Ashura. 3 removal of Ashura banners. 8 provoking distribution of some security forces in front of Ashura funeral processions, in addition to stopping some of the participants in these occasions to ask them to present their IDs, in addition to subjecting some very restrictive limitations and measures to do or organize such funeral processions. All of these events were documented in 25 regions around Bahrain. There were raids, over 50 raids in Bahrain. Some of them were in Sanabis and 11 in Mujaydra and 10 in Karara, and the other raids are mentioned in the report. This kind of religious restrictions wasn't really just restricted to the funeral measures or scenes or the preachers. It also targeted the prisons. The three independent NGOs documented in Jau prison that the prisoners were deprived from celebrating any Ashura occasions in cellar number 2 and the building 10. Due to this, the prisoners of conscience or opinion did a strike and protested this kind of prevention, and they requested that they have a right to celebrate such religious celebrations or processions. And despite all of these arbitrary practices, the Bahraini newspapers who are permitted to work in Bahrain because they speak in the name of the Bahraini authority described what happened against Ashura season as accomplishments. And also the newspapers have totally hid what really happened against the terrorizing against Bahraini citizens to practice their religious rights. This report publishes 10 articles in this regards. At the end of the report, the three organizations presented 6 recommendations to the Bahraini authorities. They demanded them to stop the restrictions against the prisoners in practicing their religious rights and to improve the whole environment of the prison. Second, to stop targeting the Ashura season and the funeral processions for the Shaheed citizens. Third, to respect the national and international conventions which criminalizes the religious discrimination, and to hold accountable everyone who is doing these violations. Fourth, to not interfere in these special practices for these religious rights. Fifth, to allow the UN rapporteur who is in charge for the religious freedom to visit Bahrain. Sixth, to hold accountable everyone who is involved, especially the heads of the prisons, in violating the religious freedom, especially in Ashura season. And we hope from the UN Commission for Human Rights to support the Shaheed citizens in practicing the religious rights without any restriction or targeting. This report will be published on the official websites of these 3 organizations, and we have very little hope that the Bahraini authorities will take that into account and respond to it. Thank you, researcher Ghanari Bai. And now we shall watch a small film or a short film from Lu'lu'a, which really depicts the violations against the Shia citizens, especially in the Ashura season, and particularly this year. Let's watch this short movie. So after we have watched this short movie which highlights the tyranny, the religious tyranny, and the violations and the restrictions against the Shiite citizens. We shall be now with the person in charge for religious rights, for Mr. Abbas Shubar, and the Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. Welcome, and peace be upon you all. The actual reality for religious freedoms in Bahrain, in addition that the human being suffers from a lot of other problems, the Bahraini authorities still try to subject a lot of restrictions, especially against the Shiite citizens. This happened especially after the protests began in 2011 to claim their human rights, and up to this day, these restrictions are still being targeted against the Shiite institutions and the scholars and all the social VIPs and the different regions. A lot of people, especially the Shiite citizens, have been suffered violations. The most of which is very important is being marginalized in the job market and preventing them from working in governmental institutions, neither promoting them to some of the posts and some of the institutions. And in 2011, they started destroying the mosques, and many mosques were destroyed. They were around 38 mosques. Some of them only were reconstructed, but others weren't. And until today, some people still insist that they have the right to pray in such places, but they are faced by the authorities, which would send their security forces to exercise pressure against these people to prevent them from praying in these places, although they were previous mosques for the Shiite sect. We are well aware that in every Ashura season, we notice a lot of violations which occur against the Shiite sect, especially as for calling them for investigations, which is mainly against the religious scholars and the preachers, and also those who preach or say poems. They would be subject to such violations. In order to terrorize them and try to hold them accountable to some of the religious terms that they use in their statements or their poems or whatever they chant. Some institutions were actually dissolved by the Bahraini authorities. We had the Islamic Scholarship Council, or for scholars, which is one of the most important institutions. It used to gather most of the Shiite scholars around Bahrain, and it was dissolved by the Bahraini authorities. Especially after the events that took place in 2011. And also we have the Tawaya Association, which stands for awareness, which was also shut down after these events, knowing that these two institutions or organizations are purely religious and they don't interfere in political affairs at all. Also, the authorities tried to arrest a lot of the people, the heads of the people who work in these institutions, and to punish the religious men who were members in these organizations or institutions. And it attempted also to exercise pressure on these institutions and their members. At several times, it tried to terrorize them, especially the religious symbols who were present at these two institutions, and especially the Islamic Council for Scholars. That's why we witnessed the arrest of the scholar Sayyid Majid al-Mashhal and Sheikh Fadl Azaki and Sheikh al-Mansi and other people who were all scholars and were all members at these institutions, and they played a role in spreading the religious awareness among the Shiite sect. Also, we noticed that taking the nationality from the citizens or depriving them from their nationality from some Shiite scholars like Ayatollah Sheikh Isa Qasim and Sheikh Hussein Najadi and Sheikh Muhammad Sanad, in addition to other scholars who were deprived from their nationalities, which is the Bahraini nationality, although these are original Bahraini citizens. They didn't hold any other nationality before the Bahraini nationality, and they were born in this country and their ancestors belonged to this country, and despite all of this they were deprived from their nationality only because they belong to these religious associations or institutions which belong to the Shiite sect. And all of this was done to punish the Shiite component who form the political majority who protested to claim political reforms in 2011. There are other persons and academics who are subject to similar issues and similar problems, being deprived from the nationality. Even their children were affected by this, and their families were affected by this, by the deprivation from nationality. As for the report on Ashura, we monitor on a yearly basis the problems which occur in this season, and we issue this report, which is only an example of many other examples on the crimes which occur against the Shiite citizens in Bahrain. We try our best to really tell the people around the world what's going on in Bahrain and to encourage the Bahraini authorities to execute the recommendations of Basuni Committee, the same committee which was formed by the king himself, and also to exercise pressure on the Bahraini authorities to actually execute the laws which prevent any sort of religious discrimination, as well as to hold accountable all the people who committed such assaults against this a very original component in the country. Thank you, the head of religious freedoms at Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, Ms. Said Abbas Shubar. Thank you. Now, if you have any interventions from participants, would you like to make any comments? I would like to remind all of our followers on YouTube that they can send any question or to comment in the YouTube comment box or on Twitter. I would like to ask Said Abbas Shubar. You spoke about recommendations mentioned in this report for the Bahraini authorities in order to diminish the violations, in order to eliminate them at the end. But what if the Bahraini authorities didn't respond to these recommendations? Is there any alternative step to be taken? We are trying our best to deliver these recommendations to everyone concerned in the Bahraini authorities, and also delivered them to international organizations, especially the United Nations. This monitoring, as you well know, it can reach the observers, those who observe and monitor the Bahraini issues or affairs. And unfortunately, we have a real problem because there's no mechanisms, abiding mechanisms for these countries or these states to fix the situation for real, unless there are real political changes going on, or through some changes which might occur in the whole region. This might impact the reforms in this country or another country. That's why through the monitoring that we do, this will definitely contribute in assuring these rights and to make sure also that in case any reform to take place, all the people who were subject to violations, whether they were in prison or outside prison, probably they might have the chance to hold the people who committed these violations accountable. They might present their testimonies, but if you don't have any testimonies and we don't have any reforms, so how would we be able to hold them accountable for their violations against humanity and against this very important component? Thank you, Said Abbas Shubar. Ms. Ibtisam, you are documenting the violations in the field. To what extent you really believe in a serious reform in the country? Actually, when we go back to the Bassiouni recommendations 10 years before, we find that what Bassiouni observed and recommended to be improved and to change the reality, we still suffer from until this moment. The prisoners are still being restricted in their movements, and in the investigation rooms we see sectarian assaults being used, and we are witnessing this also in the field. There are a lot of sports programs, there are social programs are being organized in a very easy way, and the whole country would facilitate organizing such events. But on the other hand, the Ashura or the religious celebrations would be restricted, especially when it's related to the majority of the Bahraini people. We think that there should be a real political decision, a serious decision to change this reality, because these recommendations by this report or previous reports or UN reports or the European Union and all the friends around the world would recommend that the Bahraini regime would actually work on ameliorating the status of human rights, but there should be a very serious political decision to change this reality and to change the image of Bahrain due to these violations. Thank you, Ms. Ibtisam. Ms. Ghana, do you agree with Ms. Ibtisam that the sovereignty decision and the political decision would contribute to changing the image of Bahrain, you as international or human rights organization? Do you think that this human rights would have any changes or would reach any achievements or results? 100%. I completely agree with Ms. Ibtisam and also Said Abbas Shubar in what they have mentioned. The Bahraini authorities are claiming that they are doing reforms, but in reality, these claims are intangible. The NGOs are monitoring daily violations for a whole decade on a daily basis. The whole aim of NGOs not to show the black face or black image of the authority and their violations, but we are trying to diminish this kind of violations which are subject against the Bahraini citizens. That's why we are asking the Bahraini authorities, since we are independent human rights organizations, prove us wrong and do real reforms, real tangible reforms. This is all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Ghana Ribai. This webinar you can watch through YouTube. Link for Salam for Democracy and Human Rights in Arabic and in English, and also in its different accounts in Twitter in both languages. We came to an end to this webinar. Thank you everyone for following us and watching us. This webinar was organized by Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, and Bahrain Forum for Human Rights. Thank you for the speakers, participants,